Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event on maximizing the return on your Office 365 licenses. Just some quick housekeeping. We are recording the event, so expect to receive the recording as well as the slides by the end of this week. And if you do have questions, feel free to enter them into the question or chat boxes on the right panel of GoToWebinar. We won't be answering questions live on the event, but if you do enter them in, we'll follow up with the blog post and make sure that you guys all get access to that as well. So without further ado, I will introduce Nigel Williams.
Thank you, Laura. So welcome again to today's webinar on maximizing the return on your Office 365 licenses. I'm Nigel Williams, CMO at Quadratec, and I'll be presenting along with my colleague, Doug Davis, Quadratec product owner and Office 365 veteran. Today we plan to show you how to develop an approach to Office 365 license management that enables you to buy only what you need, when you need it, and adopt all that you buy. So let's take a look at the agenda items we're going to cover. We're going to start by providing an overview of the Office 365 licensing in terms of the landscape, the license lifecycle, and the opportunities available to you from that. The opportunities we're describing are pretty much a product of an understanding of the license lifecycle. So we'll need to spend a few minutes on that. Once I've done that, I'm going to hand over to Doug, and he's going to walk through how we approach managing the license lifecycle from a data and a technology perspective, in particular, getting those license insights from reporting, managing by policy and delegating to users, defining or refining the model you have for chargeback and internal billing, and how you're going to boost that adoption and drive that adoption. And then Doug's going to hand back to me, and I'll walk you briefly through the process of getting to effective licensing, which is co-built with an industry license expert. We define that in 7 steps, and we'll wrap up with an overview of what you might be able to actually save and the business case to take some actions to realize those savings. So this is our view of the Office 365 licensing landscape as we see it, and it really consists of 3 sections. The first is your workforce, which consists of a lot of different roles and different types of roles, perhaps more importantly, each with different functional needs. So for example, you might have frontline workers such as floor workers in manufacturing, nurses in healthcare, and it might be that they access all their information through their browsers, for example, and they don't author content. That could be a discrete group of users, although you might have multiple different classes of frontline workers. Their needs would be different to light Office users as opposed to power users who do use Office 365 to author and access the applications on their desktop. Second is the actual workplace, which consists of the workloads your workforce needs to do their jobs. And it's really about how you match the workforce and the workplace. The last part, of course, is the licensing options. There are a lot of licensing options, particularly between the bundles and the a la carte options. And there's lots of ways to fulfill a given requirement. So you might be thinking about those light Office workers with 365 Pro Plus and E1, or you might use an E3 bundle. And the goal, of course, is to fill your requirements at the best possible price. Now let's move to the actual license life cycle, which is represented in this diagram, and we're looking at the stages. Licenses, you purchase them, you assign them to a user, you deploy them to the user's account, and the user then adopts them. Optimized is not a stage of the licensing lifecycle, it's our desirable end state. And if the licensing is fully optimized, all of the bars will be the same size with no gaps in a perfect world. Coming to those gaps, there's usually 2 big ones in the license lifecycle. Purchase to assigned, which represents over purchasing, and assigned stroke deployed to adopted, which represents underutilization. So if we start with the gap between purchase to assigned, what's the cause here? Why such a disparity? And it's people's behavior really. It's caused by the differing needs of people involved in the buying and selling of those Office 365 licenses. You've got a buying team of procurement, IT, and the business, and then you've got the Microsoft license sellers. And each of those different groups of individuals have varying needs. They've got different constraints upon them. And some of those groups are also subject to specific incentives that affect their behavior. So purchasing is typically subject to procurement cycles, which naturally leads to an upfront kind of licensing approach to tide the organization over to the next cycle when funding becomes available again. And most organizations, funding is cyclical, or at least subject to an approval process. IT is well aware of that. And so it's learned to pool licenses and work with pools of licenses. That's how we worked on-prem in particular. And purchasing managers are often incentivized to reduce the total cost of a contract. And that drives the sellers to create offers so that they can discount. And that complicates the matching of the business needs to the license SKUs. So it's no wonder you're going to get a gap. Sellers offer bundled SKUs because they make more sense to them. And then when you put all of that together, you get the gap. And what we saw across 3.4 million users of reporting was an 18% delta, which is pretty big. And we'll come to later in the presentation what that actually represents in terms of money. The other significant licensing gap is between the licenses assigned, stroke deployed, and those actively used. And there's several factors behind that. It's largely about the knowledge of the user licensing requirements is just far from perfect. If you really want to get a clear understanding of that, you need to embrace user experience techniques and build functional profiles for roles and match the workload functions to them. And that's growing as a practice, but it's not universal. And the lack of a clear understanding of functional needs by role just leads naturally to unused functionality. Users get assigned licenses based on a rather loose understanding of what they need, and so the fit just isn't precise. Few organizations are also equipped to deliver users what they need to make use of the functionality when they're assigned the 365 licenses. That is a real significant challenge. The rise of that discipline is either adoption or readiness to drive the adoption and to get people to get to good utilization. And Microsoft plays an active part in that as well, but it's new. So if you look at what Microsoft Service Adoption Specialists do today, it's pretty demanding. It's a demanding discipline because they need to have knowledge of organizational development, marketing, communications. They need some business acumen. They need technical competence in the actual workloads and show some leadership. So you've got a gap in purchasing. You've got a gap in utilization. Let's go to the next slide. And that gives you two opportunities: to stop over purchasing and buy only what you need, and to increase the utilization and to effectively adopt all that you buy. That's a kind of licensing nirvana, and you can argue it's never going to be that precise a match. But the world has changed from the point where it needs to be a gas tank type of approach, a reservoir of licenses. We have got to the point where we can be much more accurate with our buying, especially if we work to user profiles, tailor licensing, and we use some of the tools and some of the data that can help us get that right. And that's exactly what Doug is going to talk to us about now. So over to you, Doug.
Great, thanks, Nigel, and welcome everybody. So let's take a look at how Quadratech is going to be applying some technology to that. So let's put all this together. Let's talk from a technology perspective for the next little while. Quadratech has introduced into the market a product called Nova. Nova has 5 core pillars, so it's a multi-pillared approach to Office 365 management and just infrastructure. And from the perspective of what we're going to be talking about today is one of those 2 core pillars. There are 3 pillars that I can talk about today, which is about migration, integration, security and audit, and service monitoring. We're going to be focusing on 2 core pillars, which are the reporting and adoption tools. This allows you to report heavily across all your workloads and a lot of the underlying configuration and settings of Office 365, and then also enforce and move forward adoption, which is part of the lifecycle management, license lifecycle management that we're talking about today. Then delegation and policy control, which is really, down to a very granular level, the ability to push policies and actions down to the people that's the most impacted by that. And in the context of licensing, we'll see how this really applies as well. So for the next little while, we're going to be going through how Nova implements this license lifecycle management approach. Let's dig a little bit deeper into how this actually looks from a process point of view. Like a lot of lifecycle management approaches, there's a lot of different factors, a lot of different people that come into play in a lot of different domains. In this particular one, we're going to start with the licensing reporting, which fits primarily within the finance domain. So they want to understand around the question of buy only what you need. So what are we actually going to need to enable our workforce to deliver functionality and value within the Office 365 framework? But then I'm going to have to look at that and say, I need to make sure that I maintain control over this. And this is really where that gap that we've been seeing is quite clear, that we're not really keeping the level of control that we need to for this. So we're going to take a look at internal billing. How do we understand how we do our billing for internal components of our organization, be it at a business unit or at any kind of line of business approach for that? And that's still within the financial domain, so that at the end of that particular part of the life cycle, I understand what I have and I understand how it's filtering down to the individual lines of business. And then I'm going to switch over to the user domain, and I have to get the users to also kind of buy into this life cycle. The first part is I need them to adopt what we've bought. I need them to understand that these things have been purchased. They have a significant financial implication to have to purchase these licenses, and we really need to use them. We need you as the user to use those so that the value filters back up to our initial investment. And to enable that as well, also within user domain, I need the users to take charge of understanding where these licenses are being assigned and push this down to the lowest level that makes sense within my organization. And then I come back and I start all over again. Do I still need the license that I purchased? A Microsoft Enterprise Agreement, some of them are 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, no matter what, there will be a point where they'll come back and you'll have to make sure that you have a pretty good grounding understanding of where that occurs. So let's break each one of these lifecycle chunks into how it actually gets applied within the Nova technology. And starting with license reporting. So license reporting is really the nexus of all this. It all starts with understanding really what I actually have. So I need to understand my subscriptions. I need to understand the current state of usage. I need to understand what licenses I've been purchasing but haven't been assigned. I need to understand who is actually using it from a perspective of workload by workload, and be able to understand what is actually not being used, so I can calculate and define a defined adoption plan to get that done. And then basically move to a more agile model where I'm continually eliminating surplus licenses or assigning new licenses as they come in at a business level, and not just doing what a lot of us do, which is just buy a lot of licenses, put some buffer in there. And the buffer, which right now seems to be around 18%, that needs to be definitely shortened. And we can all see, if you kind of put some financials against that, that's a significant savings. So let's now go through on how this actually works and looks within Nova itself. So Nova has a very rich reporting framework. You can basically, and you'll see as we go through a lot of these different slides, there's multiple ways that I can display the data. It doesn't always, the way that we display it might not work for your organization. That's the beauty of Nova reporting and analytics, is that you can actually break it apart, redo it, clone it, do anything you want with these reports. But we have some pretty standard baseline reporting, and one of them is, what do you actually have? And this is a question that is often hard to answer within an organization. So a report like this is really pivotal, where I have my actual what SKUs I'm using, how many licenses I have within those SKUs, when they were created, when did I actually purchase them? And you can see in this particular model, and this is also something that you know, the 2014 was the initial purchase, but I have some other things that have been assigned, you know, in 2019, so some fairly recent additions as well. And don't forget, Microsoft, such as Flow, you see this one here, Flow per user, 2019 was introduced. Sometimes that's actually given out as a individual service, and you know, initial cost is free, or it will always be free. So this is continually changing. So you have to actually make sure you go through it. A lot of these things might not actually be cost you anything, gonna get bundled up into something else. But understanding what those are and where they are, and Microsoft actually, you know, drives this as the what drives them to give users access to particular services. So be able to do that. And also, each one of these could have been across multiple purchases. So we actually can aggregate these by SKU type, aggregated by creation type. So, you know, majority of them were given out in 2014, and also how many are trial or other types. And I continue to unpack this any way that I want. The core technology behind all this is a very rich report designer that allows me to select the data fields that I want to display and actually show it. And what we'll do in the next slide is actually show how I start unpacking some of this information, because now I have a kind of a formal understanding of the SKUs that I have available to me. How are they actually being assigned? And in this way, I can also use Nova reporting to start unpacking that. And I can do it in a lot of different ways. I can do it in a lot of different visual ways as well. So I can see it by charts down here at the bottom, how many people within my organization have exchange licenses, team licenses. I can also unpack it by particular license set. So I have 100 Power BI Pro licenses, but I actually only have 2 people that are using it. I have 8 Visio clients, but I have almost full utilization there. I can start taking a look at these, and you know, even though we will be very focused by nature on our E3 and E5, our core licenses that we usually have in place, some of the savings are in these lower components where I think, oh, I'm really excited about using CRM or Power BI. That's a significant cost, but I buy a lot of licenses to start off with, and after 6-7 months, I find out that actually nobody's actually using it, or they're not needing the license models that you want to have. So at the end of this process, you're understanding who has assigned licenses within your organization and what is being potentially underutilized or overutilized, but that's just within the assignment component. Assignment doesn't mean usage. So that's the thing that we'll come back to a little bit later on in our discussion. And then you want to start understanding about really quick wins. People that are, for example, disabled users with licenses. We find that we run this report for a lot of our customers, and they're surprised, and they always say, oh, that guy left like 4 years ago. Why does he still have a license? Because there are a lot of different ways. There's an assumption that when we disable a user, the licenses get unassigned. It depends very much how you disable a user. If you're doing it through a PowerShell script or something like that, a lot of the automated scripts in the background will not run, and you'll end up with this process where you're actually a little bit challenged with understanding why you sort of have this long list of people that are still have licenses assigned but actually are disabled. This should also be pivoted again. We can always pivot the data to whoever we want to do it, to inactive users or people haven't logged in. They're still enabled, they haven't logged in for a year. There's a lot of churn at organizations, and it's very hard to keep up to date with that. And we'll often find that we have to get out of sync. But Nova also has the ability to help with that. So using license delegation and policies, or even just taking one step back up, automating and breaking up all these administrative tasks and having policies and automation around them really helps. So for example, delegation act and policy control within Nova can be used to help with that disabling of accounts to make sure that everything gets unassigned properly. But in this particular case, we're talking about how it fits within the life cycle. So license delegation and policy, getting that down and pushing that down properly within our organizational units. So what I do here is I assign my license, I automate my license assignment by policy. So I'll create specific license policies that say that the particular license set within my overall subscriptions can be applied to a particular set of users by role, department, location, any actual, Active Directory attribute that makes sense can be used. And I can say something like, Power BI gets applied to the logistics team, but only in the United States, so I can kind of sort of have that policy created. Then I delegate that down to the person who's closest to that. It's very hard for an IT person to know who really needs to have Power BI within the sales or other department within a particular geography. I'm going to actually push it down to line of business owners, either managers or people that are on the particular on the sales floor or something like that. And then they actually are the ones that decide where those licenses actually do give access to. So for example, at the end of this, I've given engineering a number of E3 based licenses, but they also have a requirement for Visio that can be assigned to the engineering manager rather than IT, and that engineering manager can give that out. So if they have 10 Visio licenses and they see that somebody actually doesn't use it that much, but they need to take it away from that person and give it to another person, they still keep within their 10 user license framework. But in the traditional model, somebody starts to give them Visio, and you end up having this license creep over time of people that actually aren't using it. But that's now in place, and that's been pushed down to the lower levels. How that works within Nova is very simple. I go into there's a very specific area for license policies. I go into that and I create a license policy for this. So this particular one is for my business unit leads, and I can define who those people are and who they're within their delegation unit. And I'm saying that basically, this business unit lead can deploy 15 Power Apps, an unlimited number of Power BI Pro ones. I can have a lot of different ones here. So I have like, marketing license policy, CEO license policy. You can go in here and define, and it knows what licenses are available. So it kind of, it uses that same SKU reporting framework and says, you have 1,000 of these licenses available. I'm going to give 50 here, 50 here, 50 here, 50 here. And now you have this nice process of understanding, of automating and deploying this policy that has to be adhered to within those individual business units. And the added value is that this work has been removed from you. We always want to say that the people should always be focused on what's the most important thing they need to do. So keeping those IT services running and available is a lot better work than trying to decide, who gets a license in a far off department or division of your organization. So let's come back to the internal billing side of it. So, it's hard to bill somebody until you kind of have that process in place. So getting this part of the life cycle in place does require the license delegation to be in place in the first place, because you really want, people get very territorial naturally about billing and pricing, and they want to understand. So if you get a particular chargeback bill within an organization, you want to be able to push that. You want them to be able to push back and say, well, I actually don't have control on this. So, how do I actually do that? You're actually able to then go back and say, no, you have ultimate control because we've defined that back to you. You can then use the data that we've gathered within the context of Nova to set up these billing procedures and approaches. You would define and refine your chargeback model. You can do it really by any way that makes sense to you. There's no one chargeback model that works perfectly. It can be done by line of business, by user group, by role, by country, by anything that really makes sense that allows you to create that. You create reports that support accurate billing without the manual work. So, you have all the data at your hands, understand, who's actually within a particular business unit because it's deployed within a NOVA policy. And you also have the data of, what they're actually, who are they actually slot into individual users. Now, this does require that your Active Directory is fairly up to date. So one of the sidebars here is that, for any data set to work effectively, you do need to make sure that the Active Directory is properly kept up to date. So if you're using departments, managed by, whatever you're using, have to be able to do that. And then the teams that are being billed will understand exactly what they're paying for, because they have this concept of, you've asked for and we've assigned you X number of licenses. These are the licenses that are currently assigned, and whatever our internal pricing model is what's been assigned to you. So here's how that would do. The next slide I'm going to show is just kind of an approach that I wanted to show here, but you can slice and dice it a lot of different ways. But I'm using Nova Reporting's heat map capability here to show you the exact same data being resegmented a lot of different ways. So for example, the first one here in the upper left-hand corner is subscriptions by department. So if I was going to charge it by department, I would charge sales 19 licenses, development 47 licenses, administration 10 licenses, and so on. And the reporting would be based on that. And again, I would have had a corresponding policy that would have said there was a business owner within each one of these departments, whatever the manager of the department is, and that's how they would get to it. Or I can slice it by country. So this is the exact same data set, but now I'm doing it by country. So I got 41 in the United Kingdom, 56 in Slovenia, 31 in the United States, and the bills would change based on that. Or I can do it by manager. So we see here, and again, a little bit of a spoiler, this is the actual Quadratec data. So Nigel would get 7, and our CEO, Thomas, he would get 17 billed directly to him. Or if we even broke it down by city, now it changes all over again, and we got 6 people in London, 16 in Bristol, and there's 37 remote people are probably out and about within this organization. This is what you can do within each one of these. So you could define whatever your particular pricing model that makes the most sense for you and how it works. And once you have that defined, then you can create the actual underlying reports. So within the sales organization, if I was doing this by department, I would basically say that sales would get 19 licenses, and here's the people. And the sales manager or the person who's in charge of this could take a look and say, well, wait a second, Nick Harmer is not in this organization. Why am I getting billed for them? And that was where the this all comes together, because that's not something that usually, if you try to do this for an entire organization, the person doing the billing probably has very little context of what's happening within these individual subunits, whereas the sales manager, first of all, gets charged on this, also owns all this, can say, you know what, Nick Harmer's not in my group. I'm going to go into my Nova self-service portal and take them out, unassign them, because I have access to that. And now that person is no longer, and I'm not being billed for it. And whatever that person needs to get billed for, then goes whatever. If they're on a different, they say they actually were supposed to be in marketing, that person also can kind of see it and say, well, there's a request for this person to be assigned, but he's not in my group. I'm not going to assign it. And you can sort of see how, given time, and I let this kind of go through the process, over time, your licenses get right sized, and you actually end up, getting that buffer reduced to the lowest possible amount that you can. So all of this has kind of led us to wait, maybe we have the right licenses assigned to people, but what if they're not using them? So again, is the value actually being there? And that's the next part of the lifecycle management, license lifecycle management approach that we have, which is adoption. And this again is very much driven by a process that's data driven. It's real data that we're using to do this. So we have a process within Nova that's there's a formal process called Adoption Accelerator, but there's also informal adoption reporting and other things that help us do that. We take a goal-driven approach to adoption, and the goal is set by you. So you basically say that I'm going to consider a user having adopted a workload based on a particular set of data points that fit within that particular workload. So I'm going to baseline each workload with specific metrics. I'm going to say Teams is considered adopted if they, are doing so many calls or meetings per month. Mail is considered adopted if they're reading and sending email. Yammer is being adopted if they're liking the right number of posts. It's up to you to decide what those goals are, and this will be an increasingly robust and rich goal engine for that. Then you're going to proactively drive users adoption with proactive, focused campaigns. So these are going to actually be campaigns that will continually assess the data and then actually go through the process of poking and trying to get people to use that. And again, in a very rich format, to be able to do that. So let's take a look. And just want to say that we use this internally within our organization. And we had to do our Skype to Teams migration like a lot of people did. A lot of people that have been using Skype for a long time, especially in our sales organization, they were very keen that they didn't lose the level of communication, and there was some training to be able to get that done. We use Adoption Accelerator within our organization, and we got our 100% Teams adoption badge. That's something that you can do within your organization as well. So again, let's take a look at the technology. I'm just showing you kind of a one spot along an overall process within the Adoption Accelerator. It's a very easy process in the sense that every kind of step makes a lot of sense for what you need to do. You select the workload. So who's actually, what workload do I want to do an adoption on? So let's say it's going to be Teams if we're going to do that. Select my audience, because you may not want to select your entire organization, but just select sales or marketing or people in a particular geography. And then then what are my adoption goals? So I want to say that, Teams is considered adopted if they make, they join 3 team meetings, make 4 Teams calls, have 18 private chats, and you can kind of define what those are. And these can be refined over time as well if you want to. How long is the campaign going to run? The campaigns need to run for the length of time that it takes for an organization to really absorb a workload. So don't run a 1-week campaign. It's very hard to get people to change their behavior in 1 week, but also don't run a 2-year campaign. 3 to 6 months is kind of the right time frame for a general campaign. You can then break this campaign into multiple phases. So there's a kind of like this initial, people might not even know about the workloads. Let's say, we're trying to do Streams or Sway, which are kind of like just kind of snuck in by Microsoft. I want to be able to basically say, introduce the workloads. Let's take Teams as an example. Hey, you guys may not be aware, but we now have Teams available. In here, you see the template. I can create an email template with content. I can put training materials. I can make this very rich, and outline the goals of the campaign. Starting today, we want everybody to start using Teams. Here's how you can use Teams. Here's a 10-minute video on the main things you can do in Teams. We've created everybody a number of groups. Here's some groups you can try out. And let that run for a couple of weeks. Then you get into phase 2. In phase 2, you send another. Then it basically calculates through using the data. It calculates the data that it needs to define these goals. So when we're executing the campaign, it basically says, okay, have every one of these people met the criteria to be adopted for that. If the next phase, let's say we started with 100 people and 50 people are already adopted, we never talk to those folks. Again, we take the next 50 and we say, okay, hey, obviously, you need a little bit more help. So here's what we're going to do in this phase. We've identified some people that can help you. So why don't you contact one of these 7 people? And then the next phase, which is towards the end of the campaign, we're like, you really haven't gotten this. You're really not using Teams. We're going to schedule a meeting with you and come down and talk to you. So you can basically do this ad nauseum, as many phases as you want to try to get this done. And we've really seen some positive campaigns being run within our customer base where they've been able to make those changes in behavior. Now, you can also use the reporting to make sure that you're understanding what's happening within these particular workloads. So this is outside of Adoption Accelerator. You're going and taking a look at your main workload, so you can take a quick view and see what's actually happening here. So this is the team usage report that's native in Nova Reporting, and I can at least get a basic trend line of what's actually happening. What's really cool about this, and it's kind of pertinent to the situation we're in right now, a lot of our customers are seeing huge uptake in Teams, and they want to be able, in the last 2-3 weeks, they want to be able to understand, are we moving properly to this remote context of the situation we're in right now, and they actually see through these. So they see that team chats, calls, meetings are all going up. People are starting to move and use these underlying technologies to do that. But I might be surprised, come here and say nobody's using Teams. There's another thing, is that we don't want to have those, kind of he says, she says types of conversations where basically nobody uses Yammer here, nobody uses Teams. Let's make this an actual data-driven conversation. So I can go to the Teams usage report and I can see what it actually is. If it's below what I'm happy with, let's do an adoption campaign. If it's above, okay, maybe I don't need to worry about too much on that one, but maybe I need to look at SharePoint. So here's the SharePoint adoption and usage reporting. And again, I can kind of take a look. Geez, I don't have a lot of people that are visiting SharePoint, so maybe I want to do an adoption campaign on that. After you kind of go through these workloads, so go through the adoption reporting for each one of these individual workloads, decide the one that you want to start actually moving forward with, and then you run a campaign on that. And if we go back to the campaign manager, I create a campaign around the particular workload that we want to have adopted. And campaign manager will give us innate and deep reporting on that. This is a campaign for OneDrive adoption. I'm running over 72 days. I got 37 days left. Right now, I'm at 65% adoption. Here are all the people that have adopted. And if I actually go a little bit further down, I can see the people who haven't adopted. And I can actually kind of, see if my progress is being made. So I can come here every day and get a sense of what's actually happening within the context of this adoption of this particular workload. So if we kind of, back this all back to when we started, when we weren't using a license lifecycle management approach, we didn't have a good sense of what our licenses were. We didn't have license assignments down to business line owners and let them do the assignment. We had no idea what workloads were being used and how they were going to be adopted. We couldn't do good, internal billing that we had, ability to stand behind. And now we've taken Nova and we've applied each one of these particular lifecycle components to a particular technology and automation approach. At the end of this, I now have a pretty repeatable process where I can, continually assess and reassess my licensing model, and I'm using it in a data-driven automated process, which always makes it easier. That's the end of the review of how things go with Nova. So I'm going to hand this back to Nigel to take us to the end.
Thanks very much, Doug. So what we're going to look at now is the actual process and do a quick run through of how we look at effective licensing. We see that as 7 steps based on the discussions that we've had with the licensing experts that we work with. So let's dive into that. The step 1 is to take an inventory of your licenses and review the associated costs. Also look at the kind of contract you're bound to. There's some quick wins there that you can find depending on your purchase model and your renewal dates. Then step 2 is to evaluate how well your current licensing reflect your users' needs. And in a lot of cases, there hasn't been a great deal of analysis done. For most organizations, things have grown over time, it's been organic. So the fit isn't going to be that great. If the fit is there and it's a great fit, happy days. But then it's time to determine how to capture your needs effectively and also over time as they change, because you really need visibility into that evolving situation, because you're going to need to see what you need in the future. Otherwise, you're definitely going to overpurchase. And building out functional profiles by role or type of role in the way that we described earlier is really, really useful here. And step 4 that's when you really need to start to dig into your users' license utilization, as Doug explained, and that's where a really good granular reporting capability like Nova comes in. Step 5, by that point, you've got the ability to start to right-size your licenses to meet the needs of the organization. Because you should by then have a good grasp of whether you're getting the full value of your investment, and you should also have the knowledge to act in reclaiming and downgrading where necessary. So you might have an E3 user who's really only making use of a specific workload, and you could get them down to E1, a much less costly option. Step 6 is where you start to educate your users on the technology they have. And this is where you maximize the user adoption. It's all driven by education. You want to make sure your users really understand the technology they've got access to and what it delivers, but specifically that's relevant to their role. And building out proactive adoption campaigns the way Doug showed us is the right way to do that. It makes a lot of sense. You can integrate the right kind of educational content. And then you get to step 7, and that's where you can really adapt your procurement to provide the flexibility you need. So that's really about providing better information to procurement, but also having IT and the business collaborate more effectively with them. So what we should do now is sort of net it out. You can see there's a process you can walk through, and you've seen the tool that we have developed. But let's just try and net that out and see what we could actually get out of it. So we'll look at the savings and the business case, which aren't identical. We've got 3 line items of savings, and we've got one that is about increased license utilization and better user productivity. So the savings break down into 3 categories: identifying unused base licenses in the organization, identifying underutilized workloads in those base licenses, and reclaiming unused high-cost licenses, so the options like your Power BIs and your Visios and your projects. So as you heard earlier, we found about 18% of licenses across our 3.4 million users that we analyze were unused, and that's pretty big. That's probably 150,000 a year in a 10,000 user organization. That's the headline, but there's more. So you've then got the underutilized workloads in those base licenses. So that's people that are making use of less than what they have. For example, we found 22% of E3 users make use of just 3 of the top 5 workloads. We'd be pretty surprised if against that 10,000 user organization, which is a substantial organization, we'd be surprised to see savings less than another 50,000 a year based on that. And then you get to your high cost licenses where you can reclaim and repurpose your Power BIs, Visios, and projects. And we found around 11% of those could be reclaimed. And that's probably another 40,000. So it brings us to 240,000 a year for that size organization, which you could scale up and down. You could say, well, it's $24,000 per 1,000 users. It's pretty substantial. And the last element, we haven't got costs against it because it's not a cost item. It's about user productivity and the return on the license investment. But ultimately, it's pretty important to put into the business case because you buy the licenses to drive the business and to drive the bottom line. And that investment only actually yields a result if the users are making use of the licenses. So there's various ways you could weave that into a business case. Next slide, please, Doug. And with that, we'd like to thank you very much. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much for your attention. If you'd like to learn more about Nova, our Office 365 management software, you can visit the links you can see, quadratechit.com/Nova or /contact. Thank you very much.